our series of webinars on the Faith long-term plans. My name's Lorna Gold and I work for FaithInvest, which together with WWF is organising the Faith long-term plans programme. Before we come on to introduce today's speakers and the topic of our webinar, I just want to provide a bit of a background for those who might be new to the Faith long-term plans. So the Faith long-term plans, as most people on the webinar at this stage will be aware, is a programme that is being run by FaithInvest in collaboration with WWF Beliefs and Values programme. And what is the programme all about? And why are we doing this now? Well, the programme is really about engaging faith communities right across the world in planning for the future and planning for a sustainable future, and looking at how we can organise ourselves and our assets in order to build that sustainable future. Why are we doing this now? We're doing it now because our world, as we know, is going through a major crisis, whether that's a crisis related to ecological breakdown, a crisis due to inequality, a crisis that is emerging out of COVID. It seems that this is really an auspicious time for faith communities across the world to come together and to think about what we need to do to plan for a more sustainable future. In fact, one of the things that FaithInvest and the long-term plans really believes is that at this stage, we don't need more empty promises. What we need are plans, and solid plans that can help us arrive at a more sustainable future. The timeline for the plans has two phases. The first phase is from now until November this year. We are inviting everybody to sign up and get involved. And these webinars are about providing you with information and with resources in order to start thinking about what you would need to produce a plan. So in this first phase, we are inviting people to commit to producing a plan, to scope out partnerships and technical support that will be needed in order to put these plans in place. And we are aiming to make the commitments towards these plans public this October ahead of COP26. And then at COP26, we will be looking then to making the voices of faith groups who have signed up to the plans prominent and have a presence at that important international summit. The second phase of this important programme is really about getting down to business, in the sense that from December onwards, we will be looking at developing the baselines for plans, plan development, and looking at how these plans are going to be delivered. This will involve creation of new frameworks and partnerships, and the launch of these concrete commitments of what's in the plans. The aim is to launch these at Stockholm Plus 50, which will take place in June 2022. Of course, we could also talk about phase 3, which is perhaps the most important of all, which is about delivering the plans themselves over the next 7 to 10 years. As many of you will already be aware, these plans have 7 key areas, and each of these webinars is covering one of the key areas connected with the long-term plans. The first key area which the plans look at is the faith-consistent use of assets. So looking at what faiths own and have management over, and how all of those assets, whether they're land, buildings, financial assets, can be used, how they can be used to promote a more sustainable future. The second key area relates to education and young people. All faith communities have a keen interest in engaging the next generation, perpetuating the life of faith through the next generation. So in looking at education and young people, the plans will be looking at how the engagement with those groups can incorporate a more clear focus on care for creation, care for the planet, care for a sustainable future. The third area is media and advocacy, and I'll come on to talk about that a little bit further on. The next area is wisdom, which was the topic of our last webinar, looking at the centuries-old wisdom and teachings that underpin all of the world's faiths, and how that connects with a deep, enduring sense of care for the living planet. The fifth area is lifestyles. What do our faiths tell us and say to us about the kind of lifestyles that we ought to be living in order to be caring for our planet? The sixth area is around partnerships. Who do we need to be working with in order to make these concrete commitments come to life? Are those partnerships with our other faiths? Are those partnerships with secular institutions which bring great expertise around many areas of these plans? And then finally, an area that is quite distinctive in the long-term plans, and that's celebration, because all our faiths teach us that above all, the world is a gift. It's a gift, or many faiths teach us that the earth is a gift and something that we above all need to celebrate in order to care and to move forward in creating a sustainable earth together. If you've missed any of the webinars, and they have been all very, very interesting, you can catch up on any of those webinars through the FaithInvest website, and we're continually updating those. And please feel free after this webinar to share the webinar if you found it interesting. We know that many, many people also log on to these webinars via Facebook and also through the connections with many of the partners, even if they can't connect with the webinar live at the moment. So today's webinar is very close to my own heart, having worked in the area of policy and advocacy for nearly 20 years. And you might notice we've separated out advocacy from media, even though they're part of the same part of the framework of the long-term plans, but because we've really felt they merited having separate discussions. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to media and a lot to discuss when it comes to advocacy. So we're talking today about advocacy, and it can seem, for some groups or some people, advocacy can maybe seem a little bit obscure. The definition of advocacy, just taken from the dictionary, is the act of pleading for, supporting, or recommending. Active espousal. We want to, in some ways today, demystify what advocacy is about. And the first thing to really say is that if you've ever tried to promote an issue that you care about, which I'm sure everybody on this call has, otherwise you wouldn't really be here, you're an advocate and you are involved in advocacy. The basic tenet of advocacy is that you're speaking out and trying to influence change on an issue that you care about. And the other thing to say, that idea of active espousal, so through actually planning to have these commitments, to have these long-term plans, you're already an advocate because you're practicing what you're preaching. So even if you did nothing else, in and of itself, through producing these plans and sharing them and making them public, you're already involved in advocacy. But we all realise that a lot more can be done. So today's webinar is all about exploring together with some fantastic speakers what more can be done to make the most of the work that we're doing through the plans. Who can we work with in our organisations to influence positively for change? So how do we advocate internally for these plans that we're producing? And then a second question is, how can we leverage our plans to influence bigger changes? So all of us are producing our own long-term plans, but what's the kind of aggregate impact of those plans, and how can we leverage the work of faith communities globally? So we'll be hearing a bit about that. And then finally, what are the skills, approaches, and resources that we need to become effective advocates? So who else can we connect with in order to become really good advocates on the issues that we care about related to our plans? So we have 3 speakers today. Our first speaker is Karine Baghdasaryan, who's the Programme Officer of the Armenia Interchurch Charitable Roundtable Foundation. And Karine is going to talk to us about the whole area of internal advocacy around the faith plans and the activities contained within the last plan that the Armenia Interchurch Charitable Roundtable Foundation did in the last round of plans. The second speaker is Gopal Patel, who's the director and co-founder of Bhumi Global. And he's going to talk to us about raising faith voices in international forums. And then finally, we're delighted to have Dr. Charles McNeill, who's the Senior Advisor for Forests and Climate at the UN Environment Programme. And he's going to talk to us specifically about how we leverage the issues that emerge from the plans to achieve bigger change. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Karine to give her a short input. Karine, over to you.
Thank you. My presentation is about advocacy on communal levels. So changing mindset, it's the most difficult thing in the world, to change ideas, approaches, because all new things are very often considered as uninteresting, unimportant, strange, sometimes dangerous and stupid. So why we talk about advocacy? Because it brings about change. I'm presenting church and Armenia Roundtable advocacy efforts related to environmental protection on community level, accomplished through supporting of projects, raising public awareness. Social service among Armenian populations always show that church is the most reliable and respected institution in Armenia. In the course of centuries, church has been able to influence people and communities for real change. So this is one of the Armenian churches, 9th century. And the church has a very interesting ritual. It calls andastan and means cultivated land. But it is carried out in the fields and gardens by the clergy and the community. It is blessing the 4 origins of the world, 4 corners of the earth, blessing of fields, gardens, valleys, through which the clergyman uses the cross so that the blessing may bring plenty of fruit. Harvest should be saved from all kinds of natural disaster. Today, they also add not natural, man-made disasters. How the old church tradition of caring for environment transferred in our time. So the Armenian church has its social communal centers nearly in all the dioceses. So we introduced projects in these communal centers for raising interest toward the environment through trainings also. Then practical work on addressing environmental challenges. I mean, some advocating, for example, flash mobs or letters, or applying to community authorities. But how we do it, step by step, from simple to complicated, because it's a really new thing in many communities. I'll show some photos how environmental problems are introduced in social communal centers. For example, during painting classes, environmental challenges are reflected. Tree planting, gardening, waste cleaning, special classes on environmental problems for youth and for their parents. Useful things out of the waste. This is a very interesting and our beloved project. Introduction of green solar panels. There is a group of green projects. And finally, we step by step reach these events advocacy on communal level. This is the painting class in the park. See, this is a painting of a 7-year-old girl. The earth is sick. So what she understood from the discussions about the environment. Then the exhibition. Children show exhibit their work in the community. This is for community already. Their mothers are included. They ask for this kind of training. Children go and tell about these issues at home, and mothers are now participants together with children. Tree planting, very simple and important thing. Together with local clergy. This is a very interesting photo. You see Catholicos of all Armenians, the head of the Armenian church, planting trees. Waste cleaning. This is a very far away remote village. See, this girl is just 5 years old. Discussions with clergy on environment. Clergy represents church attitude, scripture attitude towards our earth. This is the most dear of our project, making useful things out of waste. Very few people could guess that this nice bag is made of plastic bags, which we get at the shops. These are wine and cognac bottles, by the way. Very easy, very simple, and they are sold very easily. This tray was found in the garbage can, and then they see. This is another thing. Exhibitions and sales. This is really community level. These exhibitions attract more people to be interested in environmental problems. Sales. What they make out of garbage, they sell. This is also useful. A flash mob. See, children themselves decided to organize a flash mob. This is against tobacco smoking. And one of its results is that the head of the community council promised children that he will quit smoking. It means that the whole council will also follow him. Green theology. This is interesting. Environmental classes at theological seminary. See, very interesting discussions. Nature protection and theology publication. It consists of 3 parts. Nature, 2 parts are ecology, nature, and the third is Bible about nature. By the way, many universities in Yerevan asked for this publication. Solar panels. So the next step of, say, advocacy on community level. Solar panels at the same seminary. Then, after these, solar panels are already established at 3 social centers, generating electricity. And the monastery of Echmiadzin, which is about 1,000 people live and work there. It is the headquarters of the Armenian church, seat of the head of the Armenian church. They have hot water at the premises, is produced by solar panels. Green Pilgrimage, a project inspired by ARC. ARC is the mother of this FaithInvest, by the way. It's Alliance of Religions and Conservation. A restaurant is using minimal standards of food established by this Alliance of Religions and Conservation. Very shortly about results. Changes on individual level, changes on communal level. Social centers initiated by church structures are gradually becoming agents for improvement of communal life. Not only nature protection, it's the whole communal life. And solar panels appeared in the surrounding community. The church has become a leader of the green energy movement in Armenia. As you see, we started with simple and easy things. The result is interesting, inspiring, and useful. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Karine. That was just wonderful. And I guess what I really, really liked about that is just the holistic nature of the work that the Armenian Church is doing. So it's really what really stands out there is the reach of this work that you're doing, that goes all the way from very much the awareness raising, connecting in with other social projects that the churches are already doing, engaging parents and children, and then absolutely fascinating that example, beautiful example of circular economy, where the waste is regenerated then into producing something beautiful, something new. And then the deeper kind of dimensions of that in terms of the discussions with clergy, the theology on which that all rests. And then you ended, and perhaps when we come to questions after the other speakers, we might focus a little bit on the question of the broader impact on society. Because I think that what comes out of your presentation is that all of this is really integral, and the advocacy dimension, the influence emerges from the whole, from the fact that all of this work and activity is going on. And you kind of said at the end very quickly, and therefore the churches have become the leaders in the green energy movement, which is very significant. It's a huge thing. And now we're going to move to Gopal. So as I mentioned earlier, Gopal is the director and the co-founder of Bhumi Global, which is a non-profit organization that works to educate and mobilize Hindu communities globally for environmental action. And you'll see that his biography is in the chat box now, so you can read up on his biography. So Gopal is going to talk to us about the big picture. So we've talked now at first about the kind of community level, how churches are engaging, this integral approach to advocacy that Karine talked about. We now want to kind of move all the way back to the global level and think about how can faith groups engage and have a really strong voice in those big global spaces that are shaping policy for all our futures. And no better person to talk to us about that, a veteran, if I can say that, still a young veteran, but you're a veteran in the multi-faith advocacy arena. So Gopal, great to have you here, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Lorna. It's a pleasure to be with you and the FaithInvest family again. Thank you for having me, and thank you for calling me a veteran. That's the first time I've been referred to that, so I'll take that. So I'm going to be talking today about faith advocacy at the United Nations. As Lorna mentioned, I run an organization called Bhumi Global, which works with Hindu organizations and leaders globally for environmental action. And for the past couple of years, I've been serving as co-chair of the UN's Multifaith Advisory Council, which is a 40-member body of faith-based development organizations working on various issues around the world and working on advocacy at the UN. And I've recently joined the advisory board for the UN decade-old ecosystem restoration, which I'll talk about briefly. But just to get into this, I'll say that faith advocacy at the UN is maybe something that many of us have not thought about before, or felt that it's complicated or a difficult process. It's certainly not straightforward. There's no guidebook on how to work with the United Nations on advocacy, but it's certainly possible. And a significant number of organizations are working at the UN or with the UN on a range of environmental issues from a faith perspective. If I can start with a couple of examples. The first is something that I was involved in, and I think maybe people on the webinar today, which was the Faith Call to Action on Biodiversity last September, where the UN had convened a summit on biodiversity with heads of state, and we, Bhumi Global, and a number of organizations, including the Beliefs and Values Program at WWF, convened a group, a faith coalition, to work on biodiversity, and we drafted and issued a statement on the sidelines of the UN Biodiversity Summit, which spoke about a faith perspective to biodiversity. And it was signed by over 60 organizations, and it was recognized within the broader summit that this was the faith contribution to the summit on biodiversity. And it was a way to faiths to show and to signal what their concerns are when it comes to biodiversity, but also what are the lenses of ethics and faiths and beliefs and values that we want to bring when we're talking about biodiversity and restoring nature and moving to a nature positive world. Another example which we're currently working on right now is the UN Food Systems Summit, which is going to take place probably sometime in September or maybe early October. And this is really interesting because it's a new coalition of faith groups that have come together to work on the Food Systems Summit. And the summit itself is broken down into 5 different areas, and you can see them, hopefully you can see them on the screen there. And you can see number 3 is the one, well, and number 2 and number 3 are probably the more environmentally focused action tracks, as they're called, within the summit. But all 5 of the different action tracks speak to environmental concerns. And so what we've done, when I say we, Bhumi Global and a number of other faith-based organizations at the UN, we've formed a coalition called the Faith and Food Coalition. And I can share the link for the coalition in the chat afterwards. And the coalition has come together, and it's made up of Christian organizations and Buddhist groups and Muslim groups and interfaith groups and Hindu groups to talk about food from a faith-based perspective, and specifically within the context of the Food Systems Summit at the United Nations and the 5 action tracks. And we're organizing a number of dialogues starting next week over a 5-week period. We're planning to issue a statement on the sidelines of the Food Systems Summit in September. We're planning a high-level dialogue and a high-level convening on the sidelines of the Food Systems Summit, and also planning to issue faith-based principles on food, again, within the context of the Food Systems Summit. So I'm sharing this example because it's a live example. It's something that's going on right now, where faith groups are engaging with the United Nations on a very key moment in the UN calendar this year, which is the UN Food Systems Summit, which, you know, as we know, as people working on the environment, food is such a central issue, and now food systems are incredibly inefficient and wasteful. And if we can reform our food systems, many of our environmental issues will be solved as well. So this is a live example that I wanted to share. So if we take a bit more of a step back, I can share a little bit about what the background is and what the opportunities are and the avenues are for faith groups to get involved at the UN to advocate for the environment. And I'll start by saying that historically, faith groups at the United Nations have focused primarily on issues of peace and security, human rights, freedom of religion and belief. And I would say only really around 2014, 2015, in the lead up to COP21 in Paris, the UNFCCC COP, that faith groups at the UN, at least, became more involved on environmental issues in a quite a significant way, and started working with the relevant UN entities, specifically the UNFCCC and the UN Environment Programme. In the past, there had been faith engagement at the UN on the environment, But around 2014, 2015, as in many other sectors, you saw a significant tipping point where faiths became involved quite significantly. And as Lorna was saying at the top in her remarks, we are, as faith groups, we have interests in the environment, of course, but also in issues which, some of us may be more focused on finance, some of us may be more focused on the human rights aspect of the environment. Some of us may be more focused on renewable energy or plant-based diets. And what's really emerging within the UN and around the UN in the faith community around the UN is that various ecosystems or clusters or groups, informal groups, are emerging, which are not just talking about the environment in general terms, but are really talking about some of the very specific issues. For example, the Faith and Food Coalition just being one example of that. And so there's a real growth, I would say, of faiths, and there's a significant number of faith groups engaging at the UN, as I said, that have been for many, many decades, and increasingly are pivoting and increasing their focus on the environment. And as a result, there are multiple ways of faith groups to engage with the UN, which I'll go into. But just to give you a sense of some of the organizations, some of the faith-based organizations engaging at the United Nations, I won't read out this list. This is just the tip of the iceberg. No one has done a full count. I would say there are hundreds of organizations engaged at the UN. These are some of the more prominent. All of these organizations here are members of the Multifaith Advisory Council and engage with the UN on a variety of issues. And so you can see, for example, the World Evangelical Alliance, the World Jewish Congress, Caritas International, the Office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Religions for Peace, and so on. Some of the largest, but also some are more national organizations, some are more regional by continent. But you see a broad spectrum of size, of scope, of tradition engaging at the UN when it comes to environmental issues. So I want to run down, and I know this is a long list and it may be new for some of the folks listening today, but there are a number of key moments and processes where the environment and environmental issues are on the table for the UN, and where faith-based organizations can have a voice and can advocate for issues and concerns they're passionate about. The top one is the UN General Assembly, which takes place in September. And I won't go through each of these, but I'm happy to answer any questions people may have. But I want to focus a little bit on the last two, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the UNFCCC COP26. They're very, obviously they're very environment focused. Those are taking place later this year, the CBD COP in October, hopefully, and then the CCC COP in November. But for all of these processes, for all of these moments, there are pathways that faith-based organizations can engage, can have a voice, and can really advocate in very, very strong ways so that the UN and other stakeholders can hear our perspectives. And the advantages for engaging are obviously to organize events. At these moments, it's very possible for faith-based organizations to have a formal side event during some of these key moments and processes, or have an informal event. It's an opportunity for us to issue statements or offer responses to certain policies that the UN and member states may be developing. It's a great time to partner and network with other faith-based organizations or civil society groups. And there are also key opportunities to engage with UN entities, and in our case specifically, the UN Environment Programme, the UNFCCC, the UN Development Programme, but also other UN agencies which are engaging with the environment. For example, UN Women have a program where they're engaging on environmental issues, and also an opportunity to engage with member states. So for example, with COP26 coming up, the British government and the British mission, UK mission to the UN, is very active in mobilizing civil society and other member states for a strong commitment coming out of COP26. So that's an opportunity where we may want to engage with the UK mission in relation to COP26, or any other country mission which we feel we have a relationship with, or we feel we want to engage and advocate with to push the agenda on whatever environmental aspect that we're concerned about. In terms of how to actually do that, this is where it can get a little bit difficult. And as I said at the top, there is no real guidebook for how to do this. But as I mentioned, the different moments and processes earlier on, there are different ways to become accredited to those moments. The top two here, to get ECOSOC consultative status or to be part of the Department of Global Communications, I would say are the two most well-known opportunities, because they give you relative access, or they give you recognition and credibility across the UN system. But what may be a little bit less known and are easier to get are membership to the United Nations Environment Assembly. The UN Environment Assembly meets every 2 years in Nairobi. And so if we as a faith-based organization would like to attend that assembly, we can, we're allowed to, it's free to attend, but we need to become a member of the assembly, and that's done through an application process. Again, if we want to attend the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow, or future COP processes, then we would need to apply to the UNFCCC to become an observer. Once we get that, then we can attend the COPs. But it's important to know that there are timelines associated with all of these. It's not that approval is granted immediately. So for example, with the ECOSOC accreditation, that can take a couple of years. At least 1.5 years. The Department of Global Communications, that UN accreditation generally takes between 6 to 8 months, and so on like that. So we have to plan a little bit in advance if we want to show up at the UN for these moments, or to engage with all these various different processes. And finally, this will be my last slide because I want to leave time for questions at the end, is that in addition to the UN processes and the UN moments, as I mentioned earlier, there are these groupings that are emerging around the UN led by faith-based organizations. And these are just three of the top three examples of these faith groupings. One is the Committee on Religious NGOs, which is based here in New York. The UNFCCC Interfaith Liaison Committee works with the UNFCCC during the COPs and ensures there's a faith voice there. And the Faith and Biodiversity UN Coordination Group is a relatively new group that came out of the Biodiversity Summit, which is mobilizing faiths on biodiversity at the UN. So there's as I said, it's complicated. It's not so straightforward, but it is possible. And there is an invitation, I believe, from various UN agencies for faiths to engage as significantly and as much as they would like to. So I really would encourage everyone to really include this as part of your long-term plans, as to how we can all raise our voices at the global level to ensure that our reach is as far as possible. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Gopal. Wow, a lot in there for everybody to be thinking about. It is quite a complicated system. I think that when you aggregate everything up to that global level, it can seem quite complex, but I think you've done a really good job in demystifying what's involved and who the key players are. And we'll certainly put your PowerPoint up on the website as well, because it's a good reference point. And I'm sure a lot of people are often looking for somebody to call to get some advice on these kinds of things. So you might be called on to give a kind of help to navigate some of these various different groups. I have lots of questions for you, but obviously we need to move on to our final speaker, and then we can come back and have a good discussion. And our final speaker, and I should have said thank you to Gopal for joining us very early in the morning in New York. And our final speaker has joined us even earlier, and that's Dr. Charles McNeill from the UN Environment Programme, who had to get up at 5 o'clock this morning, is on the west coast of the US to join us. So you're so welcome. And I think what you're going to talk to us about is how some of these issues that emerge from the long-term plans, what impact they can have when it comes to the bigger changes that we want to see, some of the bigger changes that Gopal already alluded to. And I think you're going to give us quite a specific example of what can happen when the faiths mobilize. So you're so welcome, Charles. Over to you.
Thank you very much. What an honor to be with you. I'm with UN Environment Program, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which is an international platform for religious leaders and faith-based communities to work hand in hand with indigenous peoples and other sectors of society on actions that protect rainforests at the global, national, and local levels. And I'll talk specifically about our work at the national, global level, national and local level. And this comes after last week, Earth Day, and President Biden's Leaders Summit on climate. My work that I'll talk to you about is based on the recognition that without protecting tropical forests, we cannot meet the Paris climate goals. There's just no way to do that. So we're particularly excited to display how the religions are coming together around the world to form an interfaith advocacy effort to really influence change. And the UN is working with the government of Norway and the interfaith partners, Religions for Peace, Green Faith, the World Council of Churches, Parliament of the World's Religions, and the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And allow me to give an example from just one of the 5 countries where we're working in 5 countries: Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Indonesia, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Believe it or not, those 5 countries contain 70% of the world's remaining tropical rainforests. It's amazing that 5 countries hold such a treasure for the world. And I'll talk a little bit about how advocacy in Colombia is going. And this story I'll tell actually applies to the other 4 countries too. And all of these countries are guided by an advisory council that has the leading religious organizations, the leading indigenous peoples organizations, forest NGOs, and the UN. So this is an interfaith effort, and the country programs work in 5 areas. One is educating and awareness raising for the religious communities themselves, as well as public outreach and communication campaigns. That's number 1. Number 2, establishing local chapters in those parts of the country with the highest rates of deforestation. Number 3, they influence government legislation and policy at the national and local level. Number 4, they influence the private sector behavior, especially the extractive industries that are doing so much to damage these tropical forests: the logging, industrial agriculture, the mining, oil production, poaching. And 5th area is advocating through these previous 4 areas on behalf of defending the defenders of rainforests. In other words, defending the indigenous peoples. The connection between the faiths and the indigenous people is absolutely core to the work that's going on. And in Colombia, in 2018, with a view to influencing the upcoming municipal elections that were happening all over the country, IRI, called Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, IRI Colombia worked to shape the national policy so they could influence the local policy. It was a really interesting strategy where they advocated with members of Congress to get 2 major articles incorporated into the National Development Plan of Colombia. One article ensures that the government recognizes the protection of tropical rainforests as a national priority. The second article they got into the National Development Plan was committing the government to develop a policy on halting deforestation. And with this national commitment in place, IRI Colombia mapped those regions of the country with the highest rates of deforestation and set out to launch local chapters of faith-based action coalitions. And in 14 departments throughout the country, IRI Colombia put together public debates in the run-up to the elections for the mayors of these regions. And then each mayor had to sign a commitment statement that if elected, they would actively promote rainforest protection and stand for indigenous people's rights. And sure enough, once those elections were over, IRI Colombia came back to those newly elected mayors, reminded them of their commitment, and negotiated with them to have faith representatives put on the municipal planning council, where they're now able to monitor and accompany the forested land use planning process. So So now there are more than 36 chapters all over the country that have been launched, creating a powerful faith-based local movement for education, on-the-ground mobilization, and political advocacy. So they're training hundreds, even thousands of religious leaders around the country to be able to become strong advocates for rainforests and indigenous peoples' rights. And they're building capacity, they're having annual action planning in all these 36 regions of the country. At the national level, they meet regularly with Congress, with ministers, and even with the president to call for enhanced action on forests and indigenous peoples. They've been pressing the government to increase the ambition of Colombia's nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement. They're also creating what they call parliamentary fronts, and there's where they're mobilizing policymakers into a united front at the local, regional, and national level. So these parliamentary fronts are starting to exert some real political influence. They've also created a virtual training school. So it's truly inspiring. And one of the most interesting things happened just a few weeks ago. On April 6th, in fact, the House of Representatives of Colombia passed an important bill on crimes against natural resources and the environment. And the bill is of particular importance because it puts teeth into the penal code of the country regarding the environmental problems facing the country. It criminalizes offenses against biodiversity, including deforestation and financing deforestation, in addition to penalizing illegal appropriation of state-owned land. So it's really a significant achievement, and the interfaith partners were lobbying on the congressional floor. They were pushing and pulling, and so it's really an example of how powerful the faith communities, when they come together, can be. The bill still has to pass the Senate before it becomes law, but it's expected that despite opposition from some sectors, it will complete the passage without major difficulties. So that is an example of the way it's working in Colombia. In Peru, a similar situation of electoral dialogues on something called the Pact for the Amazon, where they're increasing commitments, again, at the national, local level. In Peru, they're also meeting with the president, ministers, congressmen to get legislation passed. They're also creating local chapters and communications campaigns, media campaigns, training for journalists, and they're serving on commissions and working groups. So they're firing on all cylinders, and it's quite exciting to see what's happening there. I want to turn to Africa to talk a little bit about an example, another very recent example of achievement, and that is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Again, just a few weeks ago, this was on April 7th, and this is the Congo Basin, which is the world's second largest rainforest after the Amazon. And there, historic legislation was passed in support of indigenous people's rights to their lands and resources. And it was passed by the National Assembly on April 7th. It's really a historic moment for the indigenous Pygmy peoples of DRC, who have suffered from discrimination and human rights violations for many years. The new legislation results from the efforts of the indigenous peoples themselves for the past decade. But recently, this past year, through the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, the religious leaders of the country came together and made a very powerful declaration of support. And they too have been lobbying for this to push through this important legislation. And when religious leaders speak out in the Democratic Republic of Congo and other countries, we see that the governments respond. So now that the parliament has passed it, again, the Senate needs to approve it, and we expect that to happen. But it's another recent example of advocacy at the national level that's so exciting. So I think then to conclude, I want to say that these activities are happening in all 5 countries, also in Indonesia and Brazil. And that means that thousands of religious leaders have been trained to become rainforest advocates. And many dozens of local chapters have been launched around the world in regions where deforestation threats are the greatest. And there's a vast collection of educational materials and teaching tools for all the major religions in the world in many languages that are produced and are being disseminated through the truly extensive educational and advocacy programs of the religious institutions themselves worldwide. And this is adding up to a potent advocacy impact in terms of building political will in these 5 countries that, remember, contain 70% of the world's remaining rainforests. So I'll stop there and be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. That was just so inspiring. We hear so much bad news all the time, but to hear of this really positive story of real impact is just is so heartening and exciting, given as you say, the concentration of the world's rainforests within those 5 countries. I think what really strikes me from what you're saying is the alignment or the kind of coming together of Indigenous peoples with faith leadership, because often they're sometimes in a clash. But this is one example where those can work really closely together. And also the human rights defenders in many countries who have felt very isolated in their struggles, and how faith groups can work working across all faiths. It can really help to protect those who are protecting the forest, who are in the front line. So I'd like to thank you so much, really inspired, and hopefully we'll have the text of your talk as well if we can, and the links to some of those websites that you mentioned. It would be great. If we could invite the other speakers to come to put their videos on, that would be fantastic. We have all our speakers have been superb in sticking to their time, so we have a good amount of time for a discussion. And I know that there are some questions already come in. Pippa, do you want to kind of tell us what questions are coming in and maybe just kick us off there?
Yes, we have some great questions, some challenging questions too. So we will dive straight in. The first one asks, to what extent does the UN relationship hinge on what the UN wants or what the faiths feel is most important? Are the faiths simply seen as yet another agency for UN values and programs? The Armenian example seemed to show how important it is that the faiths have their own plans and aspirations, which may or may not be central to what the UN wants. So how is this balance managed? I think we can maybe ask Charles and then Gopal to answer this one.
Okay. Yes, so is it what the UN wants or is what the faith wants? Well, fortunately, we found an area of overlap. And it was really that when we launched the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, it was an experiment. 3 years ago, we gathered religious leaders, indigenous leaders from the tropical region around the world for 3 days under the auspices of the King of Norway, in fact. And we asked the question, is there something that wants to happen here? And we laid out the science of climate, the science of forests, and the issues around human rights, indigenous peoples. And after a discussion, we found that the religious leaders found this was resonating very strongly as an ethical priority, as a moral priority, as a human rights priority, as an environmental justice priority. And so it became something that the religious leaders realized that yes, although they hadn't focused on this topic specifically, it was in the center of their area of concern. And that's how we were able to launch this together. So it was actually coming together, not a competition or one or the other. It was a realization that the UN goals and the faith-based goals were aligned in this case.
Fantastic. And Gopal, I'm sure you've got lots to say on that topic as well.
Yeah, I would echo Charles, that my experience has been it's a little bit of both. It's sometimes a bit of a dance. Often, like sometimes you'll find that some UN agencies will expect those who aren't so experienced working with the faith groups, they may just think, oh, we'll just get the rabbi to issue a statement, or we'll get the Muslim community to say something at Friday prayers, and we'll solve all the world's problems. And we know as faith groups like that it just doesn't work like that. And so it's a bit of it's both ways. It's educating the UN on the nature of faith-based organizations, recognizing that we're democratic institutions, we represent millions of people. Our in some cases thousands of years old, and there's a certain agency that we have, which we have to be very careful about in terms of how we deploy our messaging. And so it's educating the UN side. And as Charles was saying, it's also the faith groups learning from the UN, because we have to be humble and recognize as faith-based organizations, we're not experts in sustainable development and green finance and loss and damage and so on. So it's about learning from the UN as well, and seeing where that overlap is, where that common ground is, where we can be singing from the same hymn sheet on certain issues. But also as faith groups, we have to not lose our unique voice and say, well, we really believe, this issue is important, or this perspective needs to be taken into consideration. And so it is a bit of both. And I would say there's no expectation from the UN. I mean, they're not forcing us to come to the table. It's an invitation, and with that invitation comes a responsibility, I think, from the faith groups to be articulate, to say, well, this is what we believe, or this is what our contribution is. So it is a bit of both.
Thanks, Gopal. I might ask a question that I have, if that's okay, just to follow on from that, in relation to the UN side of things. In particular, thinking of smaller faith groups, communities, national level, who might be doing faith plans and are thinking about advocacy. What's the best way to approach this? Because I noticed on your first kind of slide, a lot of these big umbrella partners are already involved. Is the best thing for the local groups to engage with their, let's say, their kind of overarching faith group, or their Religions for Peace, or one of the other coalitions? Or should they try to engage directly with the UN? What would your advice be?
It's going to sound like I keep sitting on the fence, but my answer is it's a little bit of both. If we represent a faith tradition that's part of a larger faith community, and the umbrella body already has an existing relationship with the UN, like that may be the route. Or if we're part of one of these interfaith coalitions, such as Religions for Peace or the United Religions Initiative or Green Faith, maybe it's best to work through that. But it's also the case that the UN have agencies or entities in different parts of the world as well. So it's not always the case that the advocacy needs to take place in New York. In Geneva, a lot happens. In Bonn, where the UNFCCC is headquarters, a lot happens there. In Rome, where I think the World Food Programme, or FAO, is headquartered. In Asia, I think in Bangkok, in Nairobi, is the UN Environment Programme is headquartered in Nairobi. And so it's not always the case that a faith group needs a physical presence in New York City. It can be in different parts of the world as well.
Very good. I mean, and I think increasingly with COVID, through the COVID pandemic, a lot of the work has really accelerated online. So there's opportunities to be involved in a lot of these groups through online presence and connecting in. Pippa, what other questions have come in?
I mean, I think leading on from that nicely, I'll jump to the question from Yasin, who a question for you, Gopal. Yasin says, I could see little or no Muslim presence on the UN Multifaith Advisory Council body. Why is that so, and what criteria is used in establishing the council? And maybe if you could expand on that even further, and if a religious group feels they're not represented and would like to be, how would they go about that?
Sure, yeah, it's a good question. So in terms of the criteria for being on that council, it's by invitation only from the UN. And so what the UN have done is did a review of the top 40 faith-based organizations they've worked with over the years on a variety of different issues that represent different traditions and different geographies, and nominated those organizations to join the council. And they have a 2-year role on the council, and every 2 years the council is renewed and refreshed. And so it's not possible for current members to ask other members to join it. It's very much a UN-led process, and we're appointed to the council based on historic engagement with the UN, and as I said, geographic and religious scope. In terms of the Muslim organizations represented, I just put a snapshot of the groups on my slide, but my understanding is that the Muslim groups represented are Islamic Relief Worldwide, Muslims for Progressive Values, and Global One, which is run by a good friend of ours, Husna Ahmed. So I think there's at least 3 Muslim groups. There may be more. I can't remember off the top of my head. But I will just say that that council is just one of many groupings of faith groups at the United Nations. There are other more informal groupings. I would say for our work with the environment, the Faith for Earth initiative out of UNEP is an avenue that I would really encourage everyone to look into, because that's an open invitation to all faith-based organizations. Obviously, Charles works closely with Dr. Iyad Abu Mogli, who runs the Faith for Earth program. And I would really suggest that would be the main vehicle for those of us who are doing these long-term plans to look into. If we want to get our foot in the door around advocacy on the environment at the UN, would be the Faith for Earth program, because it is a program that's growing. It's open to all faith-based organizations, and there's no criteria other than, do you have a commitment to the environment? If you do, they want to work with you.
Thanks, Gopal.
Yeah.
And I know that you wanted to chip in there, Charles, in relation to Muslim organizations.
Yes, great, and agree that Faith for Earth program is a great avenue. And I wanted to say that the Muslim leadership is active in all 5 countries of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. In Indonesia, of course, the majority, 80–90% of the country are Muslim, and so the Muslim leaders in Indonesia are really doing tremendous work in protecting forests and the rights of indigenous peoples. But in all other 4 countries, the Muslim groups are very active as well.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you. Yes, Karine, we have a question here for you, asking what have been the most difficult things to get the church and secular groups to work side by side on advocating to the wider public, and what have been the most successful?
Armenian church is a kind of an open church. It's not difficult to work with non-governmental organizations or civil society organizations. Church itself is one of the civil society organizations. We can put it that way. But I don't notice any problem working with side by side. A difficult thing was to, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the society faced many economic problems. The most difficult thing was to explain, to show people that economy and environment are interconnected. So that's the most difficult thing, by the way. And we somehow managed to, step by step, to show that the environment is no less important than the economy. With examples, for example, if you cultivate land using only chemical methods, you will, in several years, in a couple of years, you will get nothing from there. We have now organic agriculture widely spread in Armenia, so that goes hand by hand.
Thanks, Karine. And I'll follow that up with a question around the green energy, because one of the things you mentioned is one of the successes of the advocacy that you've been doing has been that the church has become, you said, a leader of green energy. Can you say a little bit more about that? How do you lead on green energy?
10–15 years ago, these solar panels were an attraction. I traveled throughout the whole Armenia. You can see, 1–2 solar panel somewhere. But when church started something, people are very interested, especially in these social centers, social communal centers. When the first solar panels are put there, people from the community come for excursion. They ask for explanation. What is this and why it is? They show real excursions. They go touch it, smell it. I don't know it. That's the way we started the work. But as it is step by step, businesses also became interested, has become interested in this, because solar panels, although at first they were very expensive, really, but year by year they become cheaper and cheaper. So that was also a good sign that, uh, and in the communities where churches have their solar panels, we see that panels are established. We see panels everywhere.
Mm. Very, very good. I think what's interesting there is how the panels themselves became almost like a symbol of something, a change that was happening, and people had a curiosity. And I think it's one of the ways that churches and mosques and other faith buildings can really kind of almost signal that they're in this new way of thinking.
We have a problem there.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
churches are very old and they are historical monuments. They cannot
Of course.
put anything on their roofs.
And I think this is something very specific that faith communities need to come together to think about, because it's a common problem. We also have that problem in Ireland, where many of the buildings, it's restricted what you can do. So you have to be creative and come up with other ways to promote renewable energy in the grounds of historic buildings. But certainly something we should be thinking about.
I show you the photo in the solar panels in the seminar. They are not on the roof. They are in the ground.
They're not on the roof, exactly. They're on the ground. Mm-hmm. Pippa, do we have other questions?
We do. I think that leads us nicely to the question from Arthur Dahl, who asks about how many faith groups have faith-inspired environmental organizations of scientific professionals, and references the Baha'i-inspired International Environment Forum, highlighting the importance of faith organizations and environmental organizations and scientific professionals to work together.
Yes, good question. I haven't, in the 5 countries we're working, we haven't seen highly organized scientific initiatives inside the faiths we're working with, although we know that in the Vatican, the dicastery on integral ecology is very well staffed in a sense, and highly technical, and have access to scientific experts around the world, and some capacity within the Vatican itself. But in the countries, actually, in fact, what we're seeing is religious groups having sometimes associations with academic institutions, and some of the Jesuit and Catholic and Muslim institutions do have strong scientific capacity that they're tapping into, and using that to embellish and strengthen the educational materials that they push through the communication. So we are seeing examples of that in each of the countries that we're working.
Thanks. It's a really good question, and certainly one that in terms of the kind of the science base of the plans that we're this program is one that we're going to be delving into a little bit down the line, because we realize that to be credible, and in fact to advocate on the back of these plans, there needs to be evidence, and it's a continuous dialogue between the scientific community, how do you produce evidence, and then the faith community, which is perhaps not focused always on evidence, but wants to collaborate. So it's something we might engage with you further down the line to talk about how do we bring that evidence base in a way that's simple as well for faith communities of all different sizes, and how we can move forward with that. I had a question, having been involved in advocacy, working out of a faith-based organisation for many years. We often faced like kind of a blowback, what I'd call it. When the team said to me that they were facing a blowback, I said, that's good, because that means you're starting to feel the heat, and you're starting to make a change. But it might be something that makes some faith groups feel nervous as well. how would you, have you had experience of that? Maybe I'll ask Gopal first of all, but it's a question for all three of you. Have you faced that sense of blowback or kind of the heat that comes from challenging the status quo, and how have the faith groups dealt with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, I've done this work now, and I worked with Alliance of Religions and Conservation from 2009. And I would say, like, in the early days when I started this work, I experienced that more often. I remember I once met a prominent academic from India who kind of like kicked me out of his lecture when I brought up the idea of working with faith-based organizations, But I think really around the time of COP21 and the Paris agreements, like the tide turned quite significantly. And I don't experience it so much anymore. I think there's interest and there's, oh, that's interesting, how and why and what, but I experience very little blowback these days. And I think, again, just to advocate for advocating at the UN, I think that's one reason it's important, because, if the UN are endorsing and supporting and facilitating faith-based engagement, it means that it's a good idea. And so it gives good cover to us as faith-based organizations to say, well, look, we have the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, we have the Faith for Earth program, we have all these other processes within the UN working with faith groups. It's an important avenue. And so the blowback has decreased significantly over the past few years because of efforts by the UN and the work of ARC and now FaithInvest and other entities really normalizing this work in all the traditions and in different parts of the world as well.
That's really, really positive to hear. Charles, from your side, I'm sure working with grassroots communities on the ground, there must be a little bit of kind of tension because there's serious interests in a different worldview, let's say.
Yes, and this relates a little bit to that earlier question of, was it the faiths or the UN who wanted to kick off this partnership? And as Gopal said, it really was, there was a sort of a congruence. It's like the saying, there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. I think those of us from the UN side working for decades on these issues of climate and biodiversity and pollution, recognizing that we're just not gonna turn the tide without a new urgency, a new momentum, and a new kind of energy, and then recognizing that there were things happening that the Laudato Si Pope Francis, that we saw the Muslim clerics in Indonesia protecting forests, we saw the Buddhists ordaining trees in Southeast Asia, we saw there was this surge of interest, and we saw the need that all change needs to come down to political will, and we need to motivate governments at new in a new way to get the laws and regulations, enforcement and finance needed. And it's the power of religious leaders, both in terms of sheer numbers as well as reach. When we go into remote villages, you often don't see government policies or programs. You don't see NGOs, but you always see a church, a mosque, a temple. And so it's that recognition that I think it was really coming together. So there wasn't so much blowback, but I think at times the scientific academic community, even indigenous peoples, may say, well, can these religious leaders help? They've actually created problems in the past. But we're seeing a reconciliation happen of historic proportions. So I do feel that it's a very important moment of coming together, the secular and the religious, in the salvation of our planet and the health of our people.
Thanks, Charles. And on that note, I think that's a really good place for us to end up, because it's such a note of hope. And as you said, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And I think that's what we all agree with this programme on faith long-term plans. And also in terms of all the scope and diversity of advocacy work that's happening already, which we don't have to repeat. We're not trying through the faith plans to duplicate all the fantastic work that's already going on, but to connect those doing plans up with all this network of work that's already happening. So I hope that today's webinar has really inspired those who are taking part to get on and to sign up to produce faith long-term plans and to include advocacy in those plans. And Pippa, you might remind us, when's the next webinar? Because I've forgotten.
Yes, the next webinar will be on the 18th of May. That will be 12 o'clock British summer time, and it will be focusing on media.
So it'll be, thanks Pippa, it'll be a fantastic follow on from this. So how do you mobilize and engage with media? So thank you to everyone, to Charles, to Gopal, to Karine for your fantastic inputs. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar.